Once, going to Florida meant a very long car ride.
How much further, Daddy?
Just one more day.
Or a very high airfare. Then ValuJet Airlines introduced
Low fares to Florida.
now Florida still means a very long car ride.
Where'd everyone go?
They're probably flying ValuJet.
But it no longer means a very high airfare.
Low fares every day, everywhere we fly.
ValuJet Airlines, an ultra-low-cost airline that was founded in Georgia in 1992 and commenced operations October 26, 1993. At face value, it's an ultra-low-cost airline. It doesn't offer much in the way of any extras, but at the end of the day, your ticket price is much lower than other airlines. However, ValuJet, while they did pretty well at first, fell off just as quickly. And actually, quite literally, honestly. The story of ValuJet is distinctive among a lot of the other companies I've discussed so far, because at least with the others, for the most part, while they made a lot of mistakes, and it wound up costing them in the long run, they didn't actually, get people killed. ValuJet, on the other hand, did manage to get quite a number of people killed because they were complete idiots. Initially, ValuJet offered service from Atlanta, Georgia to Orlando, Jacksonville, and Tampa, utilizing only a single McDonnell Douglas DC-9-21 that they got secondhand from Delta Airlines. In fact, it's probably worth mentioning that pretty much all their planes were second-hand. They didn't buy anything new because that would have been more expensive, and they don't do that. They don't spend money on things no, not here. But at first, they were actually pretty popular. For one thing, they were cheap, so affordable, and their branding was really, really good. ValuJet was a pretty good name, and they had this adorable corporate mascot, which they named Critter, his little cartoon plane. Everyone liked Critter. Critter also happened to be the call sign of ValuJet for air traffic control. Their first flight took off from Atlanta, headed to Tampa, Florida, Flight 901. And honestly, at face value, they should have been a pretty good airline. They were headed by a group of industry veterans. The co-founder and chairman was Robert Pretty, who had been responsible for a string of successful airlines, including Atlantic Southeast, Air Midwest, and Florida Gulf Airlines. So these weren't people that didn't know what they were doing, or at least you'd think so. They had their initial public offering in June of 1994. After their first year, it showed a lot of strong and very impressive growth. By that point, they'd added 15 more, also second-hand, aircraft to their roster, and they were the fastest airline to make a profit in the history of American aviation. They earned $21 million in 1994 alone, and this was probably down to both the branding, the advertising, and the price. People liked the idea of a cheap airline. It's always been a good idea to minimize costs because flying is fairly expensive. Compared to basically every other form of travel, an airline ticket is gonna cost more. But on the flip side, you get to your destination much faster, which is why the cost is usually justified by most people. But at the same time, they would of course like that cost to be a lot lower, if it can be helped, and that's exactly what ValuJet was doing. They weren't the first, nor the last airline to do that. And like most similar airlines, ValuJet didn't own any hangars or spare parts inventories. I might be saying, well, how do they maintain their fleet then? That all sounds important. True, they did this by outsourcing, hiring other companies to deal with that for them. It subcontracted maintenance to several companies, and those companies turned right around and subcontracted that maintenance again. So it was double subcontracting. Subcontracting, if you will. And ValuJet was brutal when it came to handling their staff in order to minimize what they were paying them. For example, the company required pilots to pay for their own training and only paid them after completed flights, not before. Their flight attendants only received the most basic of training, and whenever delays were caused by mechanics, ValuJet responded by cutting their pay. Which, Critter's not looking so friendly anymore. And particularly on the maintenance side, this created a work culture where mechanics were overpressured to get the job done as quickly as possible. And whenever you're doing maintenance, it's usually not good to rush things, especially on a plane. You want things to be done right. Obviously, you want things to be done on time too, but getting it done right should be the priority. Because unlike basically every other kind of vehicle, if something goes wrong on a plane, it's a bit more mission critical. I mean, let's say your maintenance man rushed a job on your car. Well, then you're driving down the road and your car breaks down. Well, you pull over to the side and you sit there, and you're stranded, and massively inconvenienced. Also, you're not dead. But a plane is different. Something goes wrong on a plane, depending on what it is, well, a lot of things can cause it to simply careen out of the sky. And while they were popular for their low prices, ValuJet started developing a reputation for safety issues. In August of 1995, the United States Department of Defense rejected their bid to fly military personnel on the grounds that there were serious deficiencies in ValuJet's quality assurance procedures. And the FAA sent a memo on February 14, 1996, stating that consideration should be given to an immediate FAR 121 recertification of this airline. A FAR is an acronym for Federal Aviation Regulations. And basically what the memo was saying is that they wanted to ground ValuJet, because in 1994 alone, they made 129 emergency landings. What? They had 57 in 1995, and another 57 from January to May in 1996, when the memo was sent. That's a lot of near misses, guys. Most airlines don't have emergency landings that often. Maybe one or two over the course of a year for a variety of reasons. I mean, minor stuff does happen on occasion, but if you do the math here, they had over 200 in 2.5 years. That's horrifying. ValuJet's accident rate was one of the highest in the low-fare sector, and it was 14 times that of legacy normal airlines, like United or American. The FAA knew there was a problem, but they were struggling to actually get it taken care of, as there was a lot of bureaucratic nonsense in the way. The first major thing that happened occurred on June 8, 1995. One of the DC-932s had to abort takeoff from Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, and this was due to a catastrophic engine failure because of a stress crack in a compressor blade. It was a manufacturing defect, but it was a visible defect that should have been caught by maintenance personnel, and it wasn't. When the blade failed, it caused shrapnel from the right engine to be launched into the fuselage, as well as the right engine's main fuel line. This caused a cabin fire and injured several people, though fortunately no one was killed, and it did happen while the plane was still on the runway, so the crew shut off the power and got the aircraft evacuated. But this wasn't the only major incident, and the other one was a lot more major. ValuJet Flight 592. 592 was less the straw that broke the camel's back, and more of the giant anvil that landed on the camel at terminal velocity. It involved another DC-932, registration number N904VJ. This aircraft was 27 years old and had been previously flown by Delta, and she was already known to be in desperate need of major refurbishment, or possibly retirement. She suffered a series of incidents in the 2 years prior to this major accident, and those included 2 aborted takeoffs and 8 emergency landings. Really, the fact that this plane was flying at all is horrifying. She really shouldn't have been in the air, as she suffered from engine issues and pressurization errors. But on the flip side, flight's crew for the day was highly experienced. Captain Candy Kubek, age 35, and First Officer Richard Hazen, age 52. Kubek had 8,928 total flight hours under her belt, and 2,116 of those hours were in DC-9s. Hazen had more than 11,800 total flight hours. 2,148 in DC-9s, so they knew what they were doing. They were familiar with this type of aircraft, and on their part, there should have been no issues, and frankly, there weren't. I want to preface this with the fact that the crew did absolutely everything they could have done to remedy the situation. Unfortunately, in this case, the situation was so severe that they weren't able to avert disaster. On the afternoon of May 11th, 1996, Flight 592 left Gate G2 in Miami after being delayed for an hour and 4 minutes because of electrical problems. Of course, on board were 110 people in total, 105 passengers and 5 crew, the 2 pilots and 3 flight attendants. They departed for runway 9L at 2:04 p.m. And all seemed normal. They were in the process of climbing when just 6 minutes later, the passengers reported that they were smelling smoke. The pilots also heard a loud bang in their headsets and began to notice that they were losing electrical power. Just seconds after that, one of the flight attendants entered the cockpit and told them there was a fire in the passenger cabin. Technically speaking, the flight attendant wasn't supposed to enter the cabin in this manner when there was smoke or other harmful gases from, say, a fire, but the plane's intercom wasn't working, so the flight attendant didn't have a choice. Remaining calm, Kubek and Hazen immediately radioed air traffic control, informing them of the emergency and requesting permission to land back at the airport immediately. A minute passed, and then Hazen requested again for the nearest available airport, which was, well, Miami. Kubek began to turn the plane left in preparation to put the plane back on the ground. And then, Flight 592 disappeared from radar, crashing at 2:13 p.m., just 10 minutes after taking off. Eyewitnesses would go on to report that they did observe the low-flying plane banking sharply and rolling onto its side, then nosediving into the Francis S. Taylor Wildlife Management Area, located in the Florida Everglades. It was one of the worst places they could have gone down, as the area is very harsh and remote, making rescue and recovery extremely difficult. Not that there was much left to recover. The plane slammed into the earth at 507 miles per hour, nose first. There was almost nothing left. Many of the witnesses claimed that the flight seemed to simply disappear after ramming into the swamp. They couldn't see anything but scattered small debris, part of an engine, and a large pool of jet fuel. As you can imagine, every single person on board this plane was killed, and very little of the aircraft or remains of the people on board was ever able to be recovered. The NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, would spend 15 months doing their normal, very thorough investigation into exactly what happened, and they did manage to figure out what had occurred here. The fire started in the cargo compartment below the passenger cabin. Curiously, that shouldn't have even been possible. That particular cargo compartment was of a Class D design. A Class D cargo compartment accomplishes fire suppression by sealing the hold from outside air, so it's airtight. Any fire that begins shouldn't have any oxygen to fuel itself, so it'll go out. Since this type of hold can suppress a fire without any intervention by the crew of an aircraft, they weren't required to be equipped with smoke detectors, as it wasn't thought it was necessary. But this wasn't the case in Flight 592. See, this method of suppressing a fire only works if there's no oxygen present. But the NTSB figured out that expired chemical oxygen generators, which looked like small tubes, had actually been placed in that cargo compartment in 5 boxes marked COMAT, C-O-M-A-T, company material. This had been done by ValuJet's maintenance contractor, Sabertech. This is relevant because you weren't supposed to ship this type of chemical oxygen generators under FAA regulations, as they are classified as hazardous materials. This type of thing was supposed to be shipped in actual cargo planes, not on passenger aircraft cargo holds. The generators didn't have their firing pins covered with the prescribed plastic caps to prevent accidental activation. Rather than doing this, the maintenance personnel simply cut the cords that were attached to the pins and applied duct tape around the cans, and then secured each end with consumer-grade adhesive tape. The SabreTech employees indicated on the cargo manifest that the canisters were empty, so when the ValuJet workers loaded the boxes, they believed that the devices were simply empty canisters that should have no issues being transported on a passenger aircraft. But they weren't empty. They were expired, but they weren't empty. As you can imagine, a chemical oxygen generator, when it's activated, produces oxygen. And the point of them is to produce oxygen for passengers if the plane suffers a decompression. They are a legitimate device that is used on board aircraft. But they aren't perfect. They create a great quantity of heat due to the chemical reaction they use to accomplish this. So if something were to, say, go wrong, like one was activated accidentally, it would not only continuously produce oxygen to feed a fire, but the heat could, of course, cause a fire. The heat would also cause other canisters to activate, and the NTSB believed that's exactly what happened. The investigation showed that the plane likely experienced a slight jolt while it was taxiing, which isn't unusual and should have been harmless. But this jolt caused a single canister to activate. It released heat and oxygen, and then caused even more canisters to activate from the excess heat. This chain reaction continued to build until inevitably there was enough heat to cause something to combust. With the canisters continuously producing oxygen, the fire quickly spread out of control, having all the fuel it would need to become an inferno. And the bang the crew heard right before they were informed of the fire was likely the explosion of an aircraft tire, which were also being shipped in the cargo hold. Laboratory tests conducted in the investigation showed that the canisters of that type could heat nearby materials up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit, 260 degrees Celsius. And the problem with a fire in this situation is, of course, not only the tremendous danger to living beings like people, but the fact that the fire started quickly burning through the control cables that ran to the back of the aircraft. As the crew struggled to keep the plane under control, inevitably, there would be no more controls left because the fire ate them all. It left them helpless, and the NTSB concluded that the aircraft was still under positive control by the crew until the time of the sharp right turn and the dive. That was likely caused by unwanted control positioning that the captain had no way to override because all her controls were dead. The NTSB report resulted in some regulatory changes, mainly that smoke detectors actually be in the cargo holds regardless of the class. In fact, the FAA went further beyond that and revised standards that required all Class D cargo holds to be converted by early 2001 to Class C or E cargo holds. Those types have additional fire detection and fire suppression equipment. In terms of blame, well, it was placed primarily on SabreTech as it was their employees, and they were the ones that improperly packaged and stored the hazardous materials. But ValuJet was hardly innocent. They were cited for not supervising their subcontractor, and the FAA already knew quite well that their safety record was garbage. Granted, SabreTech was indicted, and 3 of their employees were directly charged. 2 of them were acquitted, though. However, 1 was tried in absentia because he never showed up for court. He's still, to this day, on the run. Mauro Ociel Valenzuela Ruiz. He's still a wanted man by the FBI, and they've offered a $10,000 reward for information on his whereabouts. SabreTech was also driven out of business over the incident, and eventually, so was ValuJet. They were grounded by the FAA on June 16, 1996, but they were allowed to resume flying on September 30th. However, their reputation was completely destroyed. Absolutely nobody trusted them at all anymore, and they struggled to make any headway, but they were quickly falling off, and they scrambled to do anything to change their fortunes. And believe it or not, they sorta did. Just not under their own name. What they did was they merged with a much smaller company known as Air Tran on July 11th, 1997. Under normal circumstances, the much larger company, which ValuJet was, should have retained priority over AirTran, and therefore kept the ValuJet name, but no, that wasn't the plan here. You see, part of the reason they merged wasn't so much that AirTran was that attractive to get a hold of, and buying them actually cost them quite a bit. No, see, they wanted the name. They changed their name from ValuJet to AirTran. We're not ValuJet. What? What? Critter? What? Who's that? I don't even know a Critter. Ridiculous. Get out of here. See, we're AirTran now. We're safe. So safe. So safe. We promise. ValuJet's legal existence ended in 1999, and from then on, they became AirTran Airways. But because they were the bigger company, they retained ValuJet's stock price history. Honestly, regardless of the name shuffling, they were still ValuJet. They just changed their name in a roundabout way to make it seem like they'd actually gone out of business and been absorbed, when in reality, no, they did the absorbing and just stole the identity of a different airline. Like, what? During their existence as AirTran, they made no mention of the ValuJet past. They kept a large cache of ValuJet memorabilia, including radio ads, locked away in an Atlanta warehouse, presumably alongside the Ark of the Covenant. What is happening? Some media outlets were wise to this, and did call them out publicly, but it never really hit the mainstream. It wasn't as exciting as an accident, you know? And it did actually work. AirTran started making profits and sailed through the 2000s relatively successful. And in their defense, to be completely fair about this, they did fix their safety issues. By the late 2000s, they were actually statistically one of the safest airlines in America, having the fewest incidents overall, and no major disasters whatsoever. So, yes, they did absorb another airline just to steal their identity, to try to save their fortunes, but at the same time, they also did actually fix the problem that had caused a major disaster. So, I don't know what you want to say about that. I guess it's better than not fixing it. But AirTran isn't around anymore either. Not because they went out of business, but they wound up being bought by Southwest. While they were a wholly owned subsidiary of Southwest for a few years, eventually Southwest opted to simply absorb them entirely on December 28th, 2014, thus bringing an end to the ValuJet story. And normally at the end of these videos I have a long-winded explanation, a recap, and what we can learn from this kind of speech. But in this case, it's relatively simple. ValuJet did most things right. They were low cost, had appealing branding, and flew people from place to place. But the one thing they got wrong was major, and it was safety. You cannot operate an airline, especially, without making sure that you are doing your due diligence when it comes to safety. And a big part of that is basic maintenance. It wasn't that they were hiring idiots. The crew of Flight 592 was tremendously skilled and did everything they could. But it was an unavoidable situation because of ValuJet's idiocy. Doubling up of subcontracting certainly didn't help, and the fact they didn't hold their subcontractors to any kind of standards beyond speed. All they cared about was getting the planes in the air as quickly as possible. It didn't matter whether they were falling apart, but they're planes. You can't fly people around in planes that are falling to pieces. This isn't a dingy and cheap taxi service, guys. It's an airline with large aircraft that are flying miles in the sky at hundreds of miles per hour. You can't afford to be unsafe here, because flying in general could be pretty scary for people already. And that's even assuming that you choose an airline that does have a good safety record. But if you don't have that, especially with a major, horrific accident under your belt, no one's gonna trust you. Why would they? When people pay you for transport, they not only expect to be transported, but also to not die in the process. And it's a pretty tall order for you to expect anybody to give you their money when you might kill them. I'll give you a stupid metaphor to wrap this up. It's a bit like having teleporting technology, and you charge people for it. But before you take $200 to teleport somewhere, you explain that there's like a 40% chance that there might be a fly in there, and you'll be turned into a horrific abomination that is an affront to God and then die screaming in pain. most people probably aren't gonna pay for the teleporter after that, you know? And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Subdued 267, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Road Videos, Lord Off 444, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Redlion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues, Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Josh Johnson, Caleb Brainwaters, Perez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Dolinsky, JBL Explorers, Tommy Rossini, Ben McCullough, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mark Holding, Mr. Terevel, Hayden DeGrow, Bad Train Punzer Best, Kurt Forkham, Harry, Drew Dupree, George Kenny, Kevin Wood, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Hannah Bird, Duraushi, A Person 723, William Nemo, Dr. Racer 78, Shimasu, Metal for Life Guy, Andrew Bowen, Crimson Rose, Ryan Wehofer, Zintek M, Boss K, Orange Glass, Andy, Ohio Trucker 1, Windy City Rails, John Videola, Extra Special J, Bob Condirk, Jared Brussel, Levi Anderson, Dara Williams, DE Ultra, NJ1969, Acoletti, Jonathan Coco, John, Connor Hahn, AJNH86, Brian Philly, DFL Church, Murder Drones Doll, Nathaniel Brown, Robert Baldessari, Liam Wright, Mr. Sleepy, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fine farewell.